So delighted now to welcome David to introduce the screening. Thank you very much, David.
You're very welcome. And I'm rather moved, really, that this thing is happening at all. I'm quite obsessional about marking anniversaries and marking boundaries in time. And the thought that we are replicating to the minute the very first transmission of this film, it speaks quite deeply to me, really. It's not every television piece that has lived so long. And I've been asking myself, what is it about this thing that has given it this longevity? And I think back to the post bag that I received after the first transmission. Letters kept coming. They went to the BBC at Pebble Mill, late lamented Pebble Mill studio. And every day there was a sackload of them forwarded on. And what strikes me now as I think back to them was that Penda spoke to no two people in quite the same way. It found something in each of the correspondents who wrote to me had some inner place it reached that nothing else had. And I felt, well, I thought that's what we were supposed to do when we write for television. But apparently it isn't what always happens. Anyway, I think that's why this film still works on people, even though in many respects I think it takes its time to do its work, and not everybody has the type of patience to devote to it. I'd like to say something very briefly about the origin of the piece, if I might. Mine is a rather forked inheritance. On my father's side, my heritage lies in coastal Sussex. On my mother's side, it lies in what has been called the bandit country of South Armagh and Mid Tyrone. They're quite different landscapes to have in one's own inner hinterland. And 1972 was an interesting year for me because events in the north of Ireland in that year were pretty bloody. And I felt an obligation to engage with that part of my inheritance and as an author. And I wrote a radio piece in that year. I began it, in fact, on what has come to be known as Bloody Sunday. And it's a monumental radio piece about the Ulster rebel as he became, Roger Casement. Later in that same spring, I began to think, how do I engage creatively, poetically with my English heritage? I had no idea. And it came when the solution or the answer came. It came from something my wife told me. We'd not been married long, and she was working as a peripatetic teacher of kids who were slow learners at reading. And the job took her to various schools, rural schools mainly, in rural Worcestershire, which is where we were living and where I live now. And she was going from one school to the other, and the journey would have taken her across to a town called Pershore, and the road crossed a major road at an intersection called Pinven. There is a bit of a village there, and it's bigger now than it was then. It was never a place I'd thought about very much, really. Anyway, after work that day, and she said, saw a strange thing today. Oh, yes. She said, well, when I was going over to Pershore, I couldn't get to Pinven. There was a sign saying that the road was closed. But the name Pinven was very strangely spelled. She said it was spelled Pinfin, not Vin. I said maybe it was a Welsh speaker who was writing the name as he heard it. I looked it up in Ekwall's place name dictionary and discovered that, yes, Pinfin had been an earlier form of the name, and there was an earlier form of the name before even that. And gradually it worked its way backwards to the title of the piece you are about to see. So the process of uncovering those preceding identities of what is not a very distinguished place in itself, it has to be said. In fact, it's now a rather dismal crossroads with traffic lights and a filter lane. But the process of uncovering those layers in the history of the name is rather like a sort of psychic archaeology that you can do with the landscape itself, peeling layers away one after the other. And that reflects itself also in the process to which the leading character is submitted, because his layers, they're like skins, protective skins in a way, are taken away one by one. It's a kind of mythical process of emerging from a cocoon in a way. And it's reflected cinematically too. It was written as a film with the grammar and syntax of shot following shot and so on. It wasn't always observed in the production because I was in the hands of a great director, and he is a great director. And I wasn't going to argue with his optical syntax, but it's worth noticing that I begin with a long shot across the landscape to the line of Malvern, the line of the Malvern Hills, a distinctive, almost a type of sierra up against the setting sun. And the final shot is technically the reverse of that. We're looking from that height back into the landscape as Stephen walks back into it after his process. And as I think about that, and this is the last thing I think I would like to mention in this context, but I think it's helpful perhaps if people feel they need help. I hope they don't need help with this film. But a few years ago, I was in New York helping to launch a play, and the university, City University, took advantage of my being in New York to ask me to come and do a Q&A on Penda's film. And maybe it was the impact of being not only in America, but very close to an old Native American trail, which is roughly followed by the line of what we now call Broadway. And maybe it was the fact of being there that suddenly gave me a visionary moment as to what is Penda's film. And if somebody were to say to me, well, say it in one sentence. And in fact, I used this illumination that I had in one of my answers to the students. And I said, it's what Native Americans used to call a dream journey. You know, where in late adolescence, you took yourself off to some place that was where the spirit was very present, and you tuned in, and you might discover that you can hear what the ravens are saying to each other, in which case you would go back to your people and you would tell them that, and the elders would say, right, well, we will call you Raven Caller. That is your calling. And I thought, it is a dream journey that Stephen goes on. He has these encounters, that each of which, in one way or another, radically changes him. And that's about as much as I feel competent to say. So can I stop there?
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for that. That's a wonderful introduction to the film, which we will now see. Thank you very much indeed.